Hi, Dr. P here to try to answer a question you might not have thought of, but which is pretty obvious, pretty important. Why do so many game players want games to be stories? Because, of course, games were not stories for a very long time, many centuries. Well, there are three basic player types for games. One type says games are all math. That is, puzzles with always correct solutions in the end. The second type says games are about people. And the third type, which can be seen as a subset of the second type, is games are about stories. Games are not traditionally about stories. Classic board games are abstract. Early video games were also more or less abstract. But soon video games introduced stories. Tabletop RPGs really emphasize story compared with other earlier game types. And video games owe a lot to tabletop RPGs. Many of the aspects of video games we see commonly came from tabletop RPGs. In general, games are a poor medium for storytelling. Think about it. Standard storytelling media leave all control in the hands of the creator, whether it's a novelist, a playwright, a movie scripter, an oral or otherwise storyteller. They have control. Games don't provide that level of control, not even close. Or to put it another way, players can mess up the story. Now, of course, stories mean a lot of different things to different people. Famous old-time video game designer Chris Crawford went further. He said, quote, "Stories are tacked onto games the way you'd bolt a jet engine onto a Volkswagen. It's been dumb, but it's damned clunky," unquote. I think Chris would agree it's not as clunky nowadays. But still, it is clunky. Yet many gamers want games to be stories. Why is that? Is there something wrong with traditional ways of storytelling? I don't think that's it. Though people who want a lot of action and movement might prefer games over novels or plays. As hobby game fandom has expanded, we get more and more people who have not been game players for much of their lives. And it's not surprising that they gravitate to stories, because that's what they've known all their lives, is stories, not games. Well, I can think of several reasons, and I'm going to list them here briefly and describe each one. So I'll just show that and the second screen as well, and then go to each of the possible explanations. And of course, it's not a case that one of these is the explanation. It's a combination of things. First of all, perhaps people want to feel they're participating in a story, which you can't do with a novel or a film or a play. And that's even though most story games, especially video games, don't actually provide players with agency. That is, what the players do really doesn't affect how the story goes. The story branches back to a node, no matter which choices the players make, and then it goes on from there. Nonetheless, the players can feel that they're participating in it. Then there's the focus on individuals or avatars in games, and that's relatively new. Avatars, the human-like origin of all that the player does, that are at a risk of loss or death, were popularized by Dungeons and Dragons and the player characters in Dungeons and Dragons. Also, stories are naturally associated with individual persons. So, in my experience, the natural games for young adults are tabletop RPGs and avatar-based video games, story games. Whereas if you go back to previous generations, the natural kinds of games were different. I think there's a preference for individual epics rather than national epics now. Generations that remember World War II, I'm a baby boomer. I was born 6 years after the war. But the war was still what dominated everyone's minds in my childhood, and we still called it, and still call it today, the war, despite Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and so on. So those older generations think in terms of national epics, which is what World War II was, a national epic, not individual epics. It made sense to those generations when John F. Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." The me generation thinks in individual terms. The me generation is more narcissistic than past generations. Scientific studies show that. You can always dispute scientific studies, of course. Yet they're faced with a strong impulsion to conform, to be the same as everyone else in political correctness and otherwise, which is kind of the opposite of me. Well, what games do is let participants show off their individuality. Think of the long, detailed personalization of characters in many video and tabletop RPG games. And showing that individuality involves playing through the story of a game. Another reason why people may want stories in games is a signature of the recent generation is TL semicolon DR, too long, didn't read. Written fiction is anything but soundbite style. Written short stories have gone out of fashion, so novels are what's left. As a retired college teacher, I can tell you that students do not want to read and usually don't. They're much more comfortable hearing someone talk, being told anything from instructions to stories, or seeing it on a screen. They don't want to read. And so that could be a reason why they want games to be stories. There's also a belief that individuals make a big difference in what happens. People don't want to think that it's all about groups, but so much today is about groups and nations and worldwide trends. Because of the way the news is structured, while you hear individual stories, you also hear an awful lot about overall trends that you might not have heard of 30, 40, 50 years ago. So many people prefer to think that individuals are what counts despite a great deal of evidence otherwise, and they want to express that in their games. Where else can they? So in their games they want to be an individual and be able to affect what's going on and make their own story. Now there's also a lack of interest in history. Evidently people hope if they ignore it or disbelieve in it, it didn't actually happen, which allows them to avoid the ugliness that's often part of history. And of course, I'm speaking as a person with a PhD in history who recognizes that history is ugly, but that's what happened. Now, combine this with the tendency of the people I'm talking about to rely on perception rather than reality, a disinterest in actual facts. They're trying to make life itself a story not governed by reality. So they want their games to be a life not governed by reality. Stories are passive. If you don't have to act, you don't even have to think about a typical story. It just happens. And games can be made the same way. For example, the Final Fantasy games tend to tell stories via many cinematics, interspersed with repetitive combat. Stories take much less effort than games. Now, I prefer to think about games as a whole, but the progression from game to story is especially noticeable in tabletop RPGs. Early D&Ders were board and sometimes miniature wargamers. Over time, as the hobby has grown and we get more and more non-gamers or casual gamers involved, they aren't so much interested in playing an opposed game as in participating in or being told a story. They don't want challenge in their entertainment. The wargamers did want challenge in their entertainment. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. Some may be more valid than others, who knows? But I think collectively they tend to help us understand why so many people want games to be stories. In general, stories are more comfortable, they're less challenging, they're less work. And they appeal more to younger digital natives in many ways than games do. For example, in not having to read. Thanks for listening.